delighted to be speaking with you, everybody. And I suppose what I'm going to be looking at is the application of quality principles to assessment design. I suppose apply some of those principles to designing an ePortfolio assessment in an experiential learning placement. So a good place to start when looking at the application of quality principles and assessment design is QAI's Assessment and Standards. And this document outlines a number of key quality assurance principles under 6 themes. And I'm going to look at each of those 6 themes briefly in turn. The first theme sets out that learners are responsible for demonstrating their learning achievement. So how do we support them to do this? This includes them striving for academic integrity. So the kind of things that we might want to think about are, does ePortfolio use in itself as an assessment tool inherently support academic integrity due to the typically more authentic nature of a submission? Can ePortfolio also overtly support academic integrity? For example, in the case where the portfolio can be used to describe how an artifact within it was created. How do we ensure that our students have the academic integrity skills that are specifically needed for ePortfolio? So, for example, referencing and copying right of videos, which might be different to what they're doing in a typical assessment. And also, how do you manage the integrity of the assessment record when using an editable ePortfolio? Our second theme is assessment support standards based on learning outcomes. So related to this, we need to think about how the ePortfolio assessment will support our learners to demonstrate attainment of the prescribed learning outcomes, and in turn, how we support our learners in this regard, and what will that support look like? Is it a detailed assessment brief? So Kathleen has just shown us an example of what that might look like. Are there specific technical supports required for these students to engage with ePortfolio? Could you in fact think about structuring the ePortfolio to inherently support users? So for example, the pharmacist CPD portfolio is a very highly structured ePortfolio with the aim of inherently supporting users to demonstrate that they're meeting requirements. But of course, this also has an impact on learner autonomy. Theme 3 sets out that assessment promotes and supports both effective learning and teaching. So this includes that assessment should be planned and coordinated across modules and programs. So we need to think about how an ePortfolio assessment aligns with the program assessment strategy. For example, does it create an assessment burden or pinch point? And when describing this principle, QAI also set out the very important role of formative feedback. So again, that's something we need to think about how we're going to incorporate within an ePortfolio assessment. Our fourth principle is that assessment procedures are credible. So this includes that the assessment is fair, consistent, valid, and reliable. And QAI set out that a fair assessment should be unbiased. No particular person or group should be unfairly advantaged or disadvantaged. So when we're designing an assessment, we need to consider, does the design offer an even playing field to all students? Or will students, for example, on a particular type of placement or with access to particular IT tools, be advantaged in undertaking the assessment? What skills are going to be required by the students and staff to engage with the ePortfolio assessment? And are these skills expectations reflected in the learning outcomes, or are they reflected in the program entry requirements? Consistency is also a tenet of credibility. Now, this can be challenging, but not impossible to achieve in an assessment that provides greater learner autonomy. So how will you balance autonomy with consistency of assessment? Validity, as we all know, is always a key consideration in assessment. And QAI sets out that it means that it allows inference of the attainment of the learning outcomes it purports to address. So this links strongly to the purpose of the ePortfolio. And Kathleen has spoken about the purpose of the ePortfolio quite a bit in her presentation today. An experiential learning context, we might be intending to assess competence. So how will this be achieved? In the ePortfolio for pharmacists, for example, every cycle or activity links back to a set of competencies as one mechanism of linking competence to the activities within the portfolio. And finally, in relation to credibility, how reliable is your assessment? Can you have confidence in the result? Will you need to employ additional methods to increase reliability? So, for example, double marking or incorporating additional assessment tasks. And in the context of an ePortfolio, are such measures acceptable and feasible? And how will they impact on student and assessor burden? Our fifth principle is that assessment methods are reviewed and renewed as necessary to adapt to evolving requirements. So what mechanisms will you employ to review an ePortfolio assessment in an experiential learning context? Is there a role for placement supervisors or preceptors within this quality review? And our final principle, learners are well informed about how and why they're assessed. And QQI also set out that fairness requires transparency of assessment processes, and it's essential that learners are informed about the precise criteria that will be used to assess them. So how can you ensure that all students clearly understand what's expected of them and how they will be assessed? And I know Lisa and colleagues at ePortfolio Ireland have some excellent resources in relation to assessment rubrics on the ePortfolio Ireland website. So that might be a nice place to start. In addition to sectoral standards, a number of professional programmes will have requirements set out by professional, statutory and regulatory bodies. And today, as we're going to spend some time focusing on pharmacy student placements, I've included just some of the assessment standards from the Pharmaceutical Society of Ireland. So these include some standards which relate to those we've already spoken about. So things like clearly defined marking criteria, formative assessment, effective and timely feedback, and provision of clear guidance to students. But in addition, themes such as accounting for patient safety and attainment of competence are included. And in many professions and organisations, competency frameworks set out the knowledge, skills and behaviours that practitioners or professionals require to undertake their role or profession. An assessment of these competencies is often a regulatory requirement for professional programmes of education. So again, looking at the education of pharmacists, the legislation actually sets out that no master's degree in pharmacy shall be awarded to any person unless the head or acting head of the School of Pharmacy has confirmed the satisfactory demonstration of the competencies by the person as set out in the core competency framework for pharmacists. And in fact, this competency framework is also a key foundation for pharmacists' lifelong learning, with further legislation requiring that every pharmacist shall on a regular basis carry out a self-assessment of his or her learning needs, having regard to the core competency framework for pharmacists with the view to identifying learning activities. Dr. Light is going to look at some competency assessment in more detail this afternoon later on in her session. So hopefully that background will be a little bit helpful. There is an absolute breadth of additional quality assurance considerations when looking at the design of ePortfolio assessment. And although today we can't examine them all, a particular few came up as we started to prepare our discussions for today's event. Firstly, looking at quality assurance itself. How does the assessment facilitate internal and external assessment validation? So for example, your moderators, your external examiners, how are they going to engage with this assessment? And a really interesting question is, can an ePortfolio assessment actually contribute to your quality assurance, validation and accreditation processes? For example, by helping you to show impacts in areas that other assessment types just simply don't. Another question is, who owns the ePortfolio? If it's owned by the institution, can students access it after the course? Can they share access? Can it be locked? And how does all of this impact on academic integrity, learner autonomy and acceptability? Policies and procedures in relation to data protection will vary between institutions, but if a new tool or process is being used, the need for a data protection impact assessment should be evaluated. Data protection principles such as transparency and fairness should be considered. So for example, how students are made aware of how their data is being processed, where the data will be stored, retained and disposed of. And a really interesting question, I think, is, are you going to need specific data protection guidelines for students in the context of an ePortfolio for an experiential learning placement? So for example, could they include personal data of others within their ePortfolio? And how do you manage that? And are there ways to incorporate universal design for learning principles to support learner diversity? And if reasonable accommodations are required, can these be provided? And I haven't even touched on the tenets of excellent web portfolios that Kathleen outlined earlier.